Welcome to the Kingdom One podcast, where we are here to help your ministry become healthy, effective, and courageous. And we believe that your ministry should have access to top quality tools, no matter what the size of your ministry is. That's why we've created Spark Staffing. Spark Staffing is a unique way for your ministry to find your next candidate. We think through the lens of relationship first, cultural fit, and calling. If your candidate has those three things, they're going to stay longer and do better work. If you're a ministry and you want to find your next hire, go to sparkstaffing.co and use coupon code SPARK at checkout for 15% off your first job posting. Today, we're having a conversation with KJ about web development. You're going to want to take some notes.
Welcome to the Kingdom One podcast, where we grow the church together. This podcast is here to give you big ideas and help you get practical with the tactical. Here's your host.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back and talking about something that I am very passionate about.
Awesome. Yeah. Today's conversation, we're chatting through should churches hire web devs to staff? And I think one of the best things to do is kind of be on the same page vocabulary wise. What are some of the right words we need to use and think about as we talk about hiring web devs?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's easy to get lost in all of the internet lingo and feel like if you watch a couple of things, then maybe you know, but then like if you start using language wrong, then the people who do know are like, what are you talking about? And nobody wants to appear like a fool. Everybody wants to communicate effectively. So here are a couple of major terms that you'll hear thrown around with web development. And actually first I want to start really basically and talk about development versus design. So design is the people who make websites look pretty, and development are the people who actually build the website, right? And so sometimes you'll be like, oh yeah, we need like web design. Or sometimes you'll be like, no, we definitely need a web developer, right? So that's 101. Along with that is you'll hear hopefully some conversation around UX and UI, right? And those things go hand in hand. UX is short for user experience. UI is short for user interface. Now those two roles are both design roles. So it's thinking about how a user experiences a website and how a user interacts with that website, right? So interaction, you think about buttons, you think about menus, you think about maybe some animations or some forms to fill out. And then UX, the experience of it is like, well, how is the information on your website laid out? What's the flow of that information? And, where do you want people to go? So that's a really common way when you think about, web design, you're probably talking about a UX and UI position, which could be a graphic designer, except graphic designers may not necessarily think in terms of animations and things because that's maybe more static. So those are some common terms. Other terms when you get into the development side of it is front end, back end, full stack. You'll hear things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, PHP, maybe CMS, which is short for content management system. But the developer is really the one who's responsible for building. Once you kind of designed out a website, is like, actually, we need to build the website, right? So the front end is responsible for kind of all of that design element, the parts that like a designer might say, hey, I want it to look like this, I want it to feel like this, I want it to move like this. So the front end developer is the one who builds all of that. So those languages are going to be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then some JavaScript libraries maybe, or CSS libraries like React or Vue or Angular. A backend developer is going to be somebody who writes code that interacts with servers and databases. So if you're running like a WordPress website, for example, then that's going to be somebody who's writing a lot of PHP. The Monk development or Ecclesia 360, if you're a church that uses that, is also built on PHP framework. Fun fact, also Facebook is built on a PHP framework, or at least it was when it was originally built. So that's kind of the idea there. And then a full stack developer is someone who can do both. It's the front end and the back end. So that's what we talk about. Full stack development is like they are the jack of all trades that does everything.
Yeah, and if I'm like a comms director and I know Wix, I know the Squarespace or the Subsplash or Ecclesia 360, do I need a web dev at that point in time, or who would I need if I need somebody on my team for that type of web environment?
Yeah, definitely. So it kind of depends on what you're after and what your platform allows you to do. So Wix and Squarespace are pretty bolted down. Even in some cases like Ecclesia, They're pretty bolted down in terms of what you can do. There are maybe like section templates that you could buy or you could import or build. There's like little code snippets that you could drop in, if you want to embed like a YouTube video or a MailChimp newsletter sign up thing, something like that. But it's like not really meant for some heavy end development work. And so you could design something and make it look pretty. And if you are a communications director who your primary focus is content management and just making sure your website has the right content, that the content is up to date, then you're definitely going to want to talk to a designer if you want to like lay out a new page and think about like how that looks, especially a UX UI designer. If you're thinking about like, hey, we need a website refresh, we need a website update because people aren't getting where they need to go. If you want to do something really cool and creative and you want to think with like ministry in mind for how you can use your website, especially like online ministry or remote ministry or asynchronous ministry, or you just want to communicate effectively and create something really delightful, then you might want to talk about hiring a developer and thinking about like, okay, we need some like custom builds that maybe our platform allows us to do, but I don't have the time to do, or I don't necessarily have the skills to do, but I have the dream for it.
That's fantastic. Along those lines, like, what's your general philosophy around like web devs? Because, like you said, they build delightful things. They build things that are intentional and really care about like the user in the end. And so, I would just love to hear like what is that philosophy to you? Like, what do they specifically do as web devs?
Yeah, definitely. So, web development, I think, can be almost, I mean, it goes hand in hand, right? Like the development and the design, but I think the developers, there's a lot of opportunity for people who like to build things to kind of sit in this like architect position. I think typically when you think of like website, you think of IT, you think of like, well, we just need things to work and whatever. And there is some truth to that. But a developer can really be a strategic ministry arm to create something really wonderful. Like I think about something really wonderful that's built and that I love getting every year is my Spotify Wrapped, right? Like I get that and it's like this huge landing page or it's, in the app or whatever. And it's just got like all these like really cool interactions, all this data, but it's organized and displayed really beautifully. But the way that you get that display to be beautiful and wonderful and reactive to whatever screen size or whatever is with the developer. And so then when I think about like, oh, it'd be incredible is if we had like, if on Baptism Sunday you had like a home screen, like a homepage takeover over like how, like talking through like the timeline of baptisms and like maybe you like highlight a certain person's story and pull in something like that. Or, for like a Good Friday service, if you're doing like a Stations of the Cross event, can you build a really wonderful landing page, even a microsite that takes you through the Stations of the Cross that's specific to your church, specific to your people, and really ties in some written elements, some design elements, some video elements, some music elements, but all packaged and experienced in a mobile phone or on an iPad, or even from, if you're like, you want to show your mom and she lives 3,000 miles across the country, like this is a cool thing that my church is doing and you could experience it with us.
There was 1 year for Easter. I know our web developer at our church, he made it was kind of telling the Good Friday story, but it was just nothing but colors that would transition and some audio. And it was this really unique experience. And people, for years remember that. They're like, remember that Good Friday where we told the story, and just a web page that could continually change through colors and animation and audio. And I thought that was fantastic. And I think you're right. You need somebody who is an architect, not somebody who just thinks about the zeros and the ones of the IT side of things. So when it comes to like comm directors and like content managers, what are the top things that they should know about having a great working relationship with a web dev?
Yeah, absolutely. So web developers are pretty nerdy. And so we're really, hopefully a web developer working from ministry is thinking around intersectionality, because a web developer, in the same way that an architect, like when they design a building, they have to think about, is it ADA accessible? And is the flow, like people moving through a lobby into the worship space, and then thinking to like maybe a fellowship hall or kids ministry area, those kinds of things, right? Like you want to like plan content with the people in mind and all that kind of stuff. And so they're really going to be thinking in terms of that. And there is some language that needs to be learned around, like what do we call different sections of a website? What do we call different like headlines and subheadlines and paragraphs and all that stuff, and thinking through that framework, I think really the best way to do is communicate with visuals, because at the end of the day, you're building something visual, and using a free tool like Adobe XD or something, even like if you have Photoshop, honestly, even if you just have a blank piece of paper with no lines on it where you can kind of just draw boxes and things like that, that helps it helps ease the translation between like, well, I don't necessarily know the right words, but I know like maybe an idea of like, well, this is what I want it to be and where it wanted to sit, and then just focus on that. I talk about this one box. You could call it box A, whatever you want to call it. And I think that like just being able to communicate visually and populate later can really help communicate that effectively, and leave a lot of room for, and this could be animated, and then let them say like, oh, and this is what that animation might look like or feel like.
Yeah, I think what you're kind of describing is like, what is that process to go from idea all the way to execution? And I think we finally have started a pretty decent workflow using Adobe XD. Can you maybe walk like a comm director, or even like a new pastor, if they're making a website update, like what is that first step, second step, third step in order for them to get from idea all the way to execution?
Yeah, definitely. So I think of it as like, let's say you're building a new landing page for your youth group. You got maybe a new youth pastor. They've been there for a while. They were focused on just getting the ministry revitalized and doing the pastoral care. And now they need to start marketing externally, trying to get new people involved. And like, oh my gosh, I don't have any new pictures, and all these dates are old. And what even is this thing? I don't know what it's called. And we don't even do it anymore, whatever. Right. So the youth page needs a new website, which can be, pretty strategic place for your website. So first, I mean, really, as a communications director, it's your responsibility in partnership with the youth director to be like, all right, so who are we going after? Is it the youth? Maybe. Is it the parents? Probably, right? And so thinking through like, all right, so what kind of information is a youth parent going to want to see on this website? What's going to be helpful for them to feel like, you know what, like I can trust my kids here. I think that my kids will have a great time here and whatever. Because realistically, I don't know that youth are going to go check out your website's youth page. They're probably going to be like, I don't know, hit me up on TikTok or Snapchat or whatever, or my friends will tell me about it if it's really worth its salt, So make sure that you have your target audience in place, and just do a quick audit. Once you have that target audience, then just imagine you are that person, and then just go through the website like, oh, you know what? Actually, there's nothing about like when we meet, or there's nothing about like external events, or there's nothing about whatever. And so just make sure that you have all the content in place, and then be able to start like, and one of the frameworks that we use is StoryBrand. So start to tell the story, and think through like, all right, so our youth group is going to help do whatever. Our youth page is going to help our youth parents feel confident that when they drop their kids, or when their kids start coming to this youth group, they're going to be spiritually equipped to take on the world. They're going to have community of peers who are headed in the same direction. They're going to be prepared to have fun, honestly, and just like be like, oh man, I forgot how good it was to be in church, or who knows what that is. Or to be like, you know what, there are tools to resource my child as they grow and into their own human being, at any moment, through lots of different mediums, through whether it's the Bible app or through social media or in-person events, whatever that is. So there's the idea of the website, and then you want to start breaking it into, all right, so here is what that flow is, and this is where I get into what we call low fidelity wireframing. This is what I meant, where you could literally just use a blank piece of paper and draw some boxes and say like, okay, so here's like an idea that I've got for the hero, which is like how we want to imagine like the first thing that people see on their webpage. And then like as it moves down, we start to tell the stories, pepper in a little bit of content, maybe some testimonials, but like, oh yeah, my kid loves this youth group because of XYZ thing. And then maybe like a schedule events for the upcoming month or something like that. And just boxes, just some boxes. And then you take those boxes, and from there, you can plan your copy, you can plan your photos, and you take it to your graphic designer, or if you're outsourcing to a UX UI designer, and so like, hey, can you help me like put together a visual language that works with our brand style guide and all that kind of stuff? But like, can we really make this website pop? We're aiming for youth parents to feel comfortable and confident and excited about their kid getting involved in this youth group, right? So working through that, and so you start, peppering it, and we moved from low fidelity to high fidelity. High fidelity is where you start to lock in the copy, you start to lock in the colors and the fonts and the images and all those things, and so it really starts to feel like a website, but it's basically just a PDF. Then you move to prototyping, and some of this can be condensed down, but you move to prototyping and you start figuring out animations. What are the clickable elements? What are the things that maybe fly in or can pop up, or all those kinds of things? And then once all of that is done, you take it to a web developer and say, hey, I have a working prototype. Can you make this real on the internet? And your developer is like, oh yeah, this is fantastic. It's basically like an interactive movie that I can just code to be exactly how you want it to be. And maybe there's some testing involved and whatever, but that's kind of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step process of building out a website from scratch.
You mentioned StoryBrand, because I think, like, what we're doing is we're telling a story. And one thing that I loved about when we talk about StoryBrand, you always remind me and your helping that the church isn't the center of the story. It's actually the congregation. It's the person that we're helping. And the moment that we remove ourselves from that equation, we actually can tell a better story. And so for that process, for me, that's the one that I love to highlight. But I do think you're absolutely right. Having that working prototype that you can just hand to a web dev, get the input, and then they can actually just do their job. Like that's a good working relationship, and that's a good 5-step strategy you have there.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the trick is, like, the website is so interesting. And I know Brady Shearer from Pro Church Tools talks about this with kind of like having a website for visitors and then like a central hub for your people who actually go to your church, right? So when you're thinking about your website specifically, like, again, thinking about like being able to use StoryBrand and position yourself accurately, but also make sure that you have the right target audience for a web page. Like, I think it's really easy to be like, oh, you know what? The web page is going to be for youth because it's the youth web page. So obviously we're going to do that. But, like, no, realistically, it's for youth parents. And so what content needs to be there for youth parents, not just so that they're like informed about what's going on, but like, how can you actively remove roadblocks from them to trust for them to feel like they can trust you with their children's spiritual development, with their children's like just lives, essentially, and like that they're putting their kids in a good thriving community, which I'm sure that you have. And so yeah, it just helps you like plan out that content really strategically, thinking for external audiences. And then you have the central hub kind of idea, where that kind of youth thing is like, oh, it's all about next steps, it's all about getting people to sign up or get that information updated, but you're telling totally different stories than what you have with your website.
It's really important too when it comes to the model of there's a nucleus, there's a hub, like an app, or like a CHMS, like the church management software, compared to like the outward facing. And I think that you should definitely be strategic around that. How do you see that working in today's landscape? Can you give me some examples of how that central hub can work for a church? How could they specifically leverage that in a better way?
Yeah, so I think of the central hub is really I think for me, it's a communications director's dream. So I recently took a position at the church that I grew up in, incidentally, as a communications director, and so I really get to try where the rubber meets the road of web development with Kingdom One, and then also communications director. And I just find that as I'm writing these announcements and trying to think about, okay, announcements go out, there's the Sunday morning announcement, there's Sunday school class announcements, there's youth announcements, there's like campus TVs there there's the website that we got to get updated, all these things, right? And the whole philosophy behind the central hub, I think, is really good, right? Like, so that every call to action is go to your central hub and sign up, which I think is fantastic. Our church has gone through a rebrand in the past 5 years. And so we went from one thing to another. And church people being the way church people can be, like, there's kind of an issue about changing our domain to what our current name is. So it doesn't exactly line up, right? So there's all this kind of stuff. But think the wonderful thing about the church hub is it is dynamic and reactive to where the church is at, to people who need to find certain information. And that's like really where I, as a communications director, want to spend the bulk of my time. I want it to be my single source of truth so that people can always go and always look at it and always like sign up for an event. Even if they missed Sunday, they know, oh, I can go to this place and sign up and do all of that stuff, right? The external website, our main, website, that's the place where I want to be really focused on SEO. I want to be focused on brand awareness. I want to be focused on messaging and all those kinds of things to really be accurate and inviting and encouraging to people who have no idea who we are, to say like, no, this is actually my opportunity to tell you a story about my church in a way that I think might move you to be like, oh, this is worth checking out, without all the clutter of like, oh, we have lots of events going on, we have all these things, and do this and do this and do this, right? And it also, I think, allows us to split out where we're asking for people to give. Giving is one of those weird things that as a nonprofit, it's like, oh yeah, give. But like as a spiritual organization, right? Giving is just baked into who we are as Christians. And so I've always thought it's super weird. Like, hey, it's your first time coming to this website, but up in the top right corner, you're going to see a big give button. Be like, actually, I don't feel comfortable asking new visitors to give money to this organization when you're just checking out, right? And so like, it allows you to just kind of abstract some things. Like giving is a spiritual discipline that comes maybe a little bit later in your faith journey. So if somebody who has no relationship to God, no interest in really being fully involved in this church, if we're asking them to give, that can be really off-putting. But being able to split things out allows you to be entirely focused on the mission, on the vision, on the evangelism of your church for newcomers, and also be entirely focused on spiritual discipline and spiritual formation and how people grow deeper in their walk with Jesus on the internal side through the central hub.
Yeah, I think what you highlighted there is just such a great topic, and it's such a change of philosophy of where we've been for the past 20 years when it comes to facilitating giving through like technology. And I love the way that you frame that for us, is that that is a spiritual discipline, and it probably doesn't make sense to use a website to be like, hey, spiritual discipline 101 right here. So I highly agree with that. And I think actually applying that in a way that is like intentional is going to be the way that the church continues to win with younger audiences and audiences of all different walks of life. So I think that's something definitely worth highlighting. When it comes to accessibility, can you talk to us about like how can we make our websites accessible for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I think is really cool because the internet is cool, and uh, and so like there's this big push, and we'll continue to see it as web accessibility standards evolve and develop, and new technologies to evolve and develop. Is there's a way to be incredibly intersectional and intentionally target some new people, especially like I don't know, like as we're recording this, Pentecost is coming up, and that's always a time I think that churches think about the global community. Living in Texas and Dallas specifically, like there's a lot of diversity where I am. There's a lot of new people coming in. There's a lot of people from like just a lot of different walks of life and a lot of different languages, right? So accessibility for websites, like it can be really overwhelming. To think about like, oh man, so every time I create an event, every time I do this, that, or the other thing, I have to make sure that it's accessible. And while yes, you should make sure that it's accessible, the internal side, like the hub side of your church website, is like it can follow the bell curve of where your people are. The external side can be a really intentional, unique marketing piece. That external side, if you like, you're like, oh man, you know what? I live in a place with a lot of people who speak Hindi. I would love to have my website accessible and easily translatable to people who speak Hindi, right? Then like you can do that, and it's a lot less work. But it's really intentional, and you can make your website translatable to different websites and like think carefully and critically around those things. You can be like, okay, you know what? Actually, we have like a really strong population of blind people in our community here, and like that's a key demographic that like we know that there aren't a lot of blind people in our church, but we're working on it, that kind of thing, right? So then making sure going through all of the things that the internet offers in terms of making it accessible for people with vision impairments, then your external website can do that, and then you can start to just kind of roll out changes on the internal side, that like, okay, so as we continue to roll this out, that can happen, but like it's just making sure that like the front doors, like as you get people in the door, like, hey, we're being intentional in reaching out to you. And I think that's the other big shift is we talk about like websites. I used to hear websites were like the lobby of your church, but like so now we're talking about like this internal and external idea. So there's like a lobby and a fellowship hall, kind of thing. Is like, as the web is just like growing in its architecture. And so we need to be updating our mental models around how we understand the internet and what it can do for us in terms of evangelism, in terms of hospitality, in terms of like bringing people, breaking down barriers. Maybe the Bible version would say like leveling mountains and raising valleys to make way for the word of the Lord to hit people's hearts.
Absolutely. I think that's like such a great understanding. Living in Riverside, California for some time, it was one of the only high schools that they had in North America with predominantly deaf community. And so when you look at that demographic, like the largest unreached population by the church. And so like when you think through that type of lens, it's how can we make, like you said, accessibility for everybody? Like, how can we start to think through that lens, and not just for people who like look like us, or who have the same who might have different might have disability when it comes to receiving the word. And I think that's so important. My final question for you, and this has just been such an amazing, eye-opening experience, is what would you say to somebody who's thinking through, I need a web dev for my church, but should I go the staff route and hire them to staff, or should I think about a freelancer just coming in and doing something really, really quick? What would you say to somebody who would ask you that question? Is it a freelancer, or are we hiring for staff?
Yeah. I think for most churches in America, it's probably going to be a freelancer. Just at the price point, hiring a staff, like unless you're a mega church, and even then, unless you're a mega church whose vision is to build incredible web tools, realistically, it's probably going to be a freelancer. And so understanding that kind of 5-step process and being able to do as much of that as you can in-house is going to keep your cost low, so that you can get a really great freelancer to go and build something for your site. Of course, there's lots of questions around like, are you on the right web platform to even be able to do this? But honestly, I think beyond even the cost of it, because like web dev, I mean, if we're being honest, it can be expensive, but the real thing is, does it allow you to dream, right? Like, and I think like if you can have dreams for what the website could be, and the ways that like the external website is your online way of leaving the 99 for the one, right? The 99, they've got the central hub, they've got, all those other things. But so thinking about like, how can I leave the 99 for the one? And what's going to take to do that, right? And like, how much money can we put into doing that? And the other thing too is, there's that 5-step process. There's like identifying, who your target audience is, and thinking through the story brand framework of a web page or a website. Then there's the lo-fi, there's the hi-fi, there's prototyping, then there's the building, right? At any point in that process, you can get volunteers involved, and they don't have to necessarily be web people. They could just be great storytellers, or like people with like good ideas, or people, who like, oh, this would be, I would just love to, like, I think the idea for me is get people around you who are inspiring, who love to dream, who like to think outside the box, because the web is the place to think outside the box and do something really creative and really cool. And as you understand the development process and development cycles, you're able to keep your costs low, because you're specific in what you want, and you're able to communicate effectively with freelancers. And by knowing your limits and being okay with that, but also knowing the general plan, you can get more volunteers involved and inspire maybe some creativity, some new excitement, some ability to dream within volunteers. Like, oh, you know what? I never actually thought I could use the web to do XYZ thing. And that makes me think we could use it to do even more things. What's the viability in that? Like, and just, I think a church that's dreaming, and a church whose people have inspiring ideas for their ministries, and ministries that they love, ministries that they're in or their kids are in, is only going to like flywheel the church into newer, better, more wonderful things and exciting things. And even if you fail, I think like being able to fail early and be like, oh man, that didn't go as we expected, but I still like the general idea, or I still like that failure may be spectacular, but that actually gives me a new idea, right? Like, that's the way that we continue to innovate. We continue to be like, oh yes, this is how we can more specifically target the one that we're leaving for, and get more people involved, and like make evangelism, make the church something that is communal, right? And not just staff driven kind of thing.
If you're a ministry leader or a communications director, one of the best things that you can do is to find a way to communicate on your website that is aimed at new people and aimed at creating a hub where your congregation can go back to take action and to understand what is coming down the pipeline. If you need any help, Kingdom One is here to help you. You can go to kingdomone.co/get started today, and you can get access to our top tier team who's going to help you think through the communication of your website in 3 easy steps. It's finding a story brand that fits the narrative so that way your congregation can understand who you are. That is so important for new people who come to your website. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to help you curate the content that's needed to go on the website that's going to communicate effectively. Next, we're going to create some mock-ups like KJ talked today in the podcast. And from those mock-ups, we're actually going to build a site that is specific for you and that meets the needs of your congregation and new members. If you want to do that, go to kingdomone.co/get started today. Thanks for tuning in to today's podcast, and we'll see you in the next one.